Hello, students. That's really awesome. All right. We are going to be talking about something I think is pretty interesting. You might not, but I think it's interesting, and that's all that really matters. We are going to talk about how did we first begin to shift in America in the early 1900s from a very classically liberal, very capitalist economy towards a slight move towards what we would call modern liberalism. We refer to this time period as American progressivism. Now you have to understand that Americans didn't want to just change everything up all at once. And so there's some very small incremental changes that happened first in the early 1900s, right? Especially under the President Teddy Roosevelt, that we're going to talk about right now. So, as Brian was explaining in our last lesson, a lot of Americans living in a time when the economy was controlled by robber barons or what did you call them? Something in industry.
Captains of
industry, right? Things were pretty good for the rich, but not so good for the poor. So how do we protect the poor, but also ensure that the innovative ideas of the rich are maintained as well? And so that's what we're going to be talking about right now. So the first thing that I want to kind of explain is that the American people, they're not going to, the thing is Americans have this very patriotic spirit. They're not going to accept crappiness laying down, right? So things in America just aren't that good, right? People have bad jobs. They're being paid poor wages. In some cases, as we learned, Rockefeller's not even paying them with real money. He's just paying with his own money, right? There's child labor. There's a lack of ability to unionize. There's lots of crap going on. There's pollution. There's exploitation of people and resources. Things just aren't very good. And so really the way that the issues of the early 1900s in America are solved is in two ways. So I'm going to explain these two ways for you first. So the first way is kind of a Weasley kind of more disturbing way, and I'm hoping you'll understand this, but the one way that the anger of the American people is resolved is through something called welfare capitalism. Now, if you're in my Social 30-1 class, you've already heard me talking about this. But essentially, if the people are angry and the people are unhappy, how do we resolve that? Well, what's in the interest of a capitalist or a big business owner to ensure that the people are happy, at least to an extent? Well, if people are happy, they're not going to rebel because, as I've always said, when people are hungry, when their bellies are empty, they're more willing to rebel. So one of the things that started to happen is that big business owners, robber barons, right, captains of industry, started to give non-monetary benefits to their workers to keep them happy. So I'm going to explain this in a little demonstration so that you kind of understand what I'm talking about. So check this out. Okay, I found something in this room. Brian Kim is sleeping in my class. So we're gonna do some stuff to him. Let's go.
Oh man!
Alright.
Like that actually hurts.
Why are you complaining, Brian?
Because that hurts.
It's okay.
Oh.
It's okay, I got you this coat. Oh wait, hold on, I'm gonna take a swig first, because that's just the way it is. Here, you can have this coat.
Oh, thank you.
So, as you can see, no, don't go back to sleep, I'm gonna shoot you again.
Okay.
So, this is just a little lesson for you on welfare capitalism. As I continue to harass and persecute and oppress Brian, and he feels it's unjust, right? He's just having a nap.
Definitely
I simply just reward him with something that really is not relevant at all, like a Coca-Cola, and it just makes him feel better.
Doesn't solve my need to
It doesn't
study
solve his
or
needs.
my need to sleep.
It didn't help him at all. It just shut him up for a little while, and I even took a little swig of it because I didn't want him to really benefit that much from the Coke, even though things were really unequal. So this is very classic with welfare capitalism, where the people's needs aren't truly met by capitalism. Capitalists just give the workers just enough to get them to shut up, right, and carry on. So as you can see from our little demonstration, welfare capitalism was a way that capitalists could kind of weasel their way into making people happy. These weren't government programs. The government wasn't providing welfare to the people. This was capitalists, big, large corporate owners, giving just a little bit of stuff to their workers to make them happy so they wouldn't rebel. An example of this going on in American history is the famous story of George Pullman. If you're in my Social 30-1 class, you've already heard this, but I'm going to give you a really brief explanation of that, what that was. So in a small town just outside of Chicago, Pullman, one of these robber barons, built a large factory where he was producing luxury train cars. And in order to get a lot of people to come and work for him, and to make these people happy, what he did was he built, as you can see from this image, the factories here, and then right across the street from the factory, he built some really nice housing complexes. Now, you would think maybe this is because he's a good guy. You know, he gave people nice houses for relatively cheap relatively cheap price, but it was all about Pullman trying to make himself more wealthy. He could keep his workers close to work, so they'd have to work more hours. Plus, he would make them happy by giving them a reasonable place to live. But the thing is, the whole time he was actually benefiting because these people were paying him rent. So he was not only getting money from the factory where he's selling these train cars, but he was also getting money off of his own workers living in his housing complex. Now, as demand for these streetcars or these rail cars began to decline, he started to lay people off, and these people had nowhere to live. So if they wanted to stay in his housing, they still had to continue to pay him rent. So even though he was losing money in his factory, he was still making money on his rental property. And Pullman also got to control how people behaved in his living complexes. So he could tell them, what time they could stay out till, what types of relationships they could be in, whether or not they could drink. And this kind of formed a form of like capitalist parentalism. So Pullman became kind of the parents of his people, his workers. And so it's kind of a negative example of welfare capitalism. Modern welfare capitalism kind of looks like this. You might have seen that Google is a really nice place to work. If you go inside of the Google building, they have little places you can relax and look at fish, and slides you can slide down, and places you can play with really weird balls, I guess. Comfortable place you could relax and chill out. You might think that this is just Google being good people, trying to give people a nice place to work, but the reality is that Google has a very underlying tone here. If they can make people happy at work, relaxed at work, they can get better workers that will work longer hours. If you have a fun place to work, you're more likely to stay there. So one of the second ways that the American people responded to the inequality of the American industrial age was through their voices, through their voting. So as more people got the rights to vote, for example, women began to fight for the rights to vote, non-property owning men began to get the rights to vote. We saw them begin to vote for leaders that they felt best represented them. And in 1901, a significant leader is chosen by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, who really changes a lot in America. We call this kind of the era of American progressivism meaning a moving forward away from the past. And so the thing that Teddy Roosevelt was famous for was something that was called, that he termed the square deal. So this is in reference to a bunch of situations where Roosevelt had seen robber barons treating their workers really poorly, and then when the workers would rise up and try to strike, right, they would send in the capitalists, or the robber barons would hire like paid militia to come and take out these rebellions. And there was one case where a coal company had been formed, and the workers were really upset, and they had come together to rebel and have this protest, and the owner of this big coal mining plant called up Roosevelt and said, "Hey, can you send in the National Guard to take down this protest?" And Roosevelt said, no, I should send the National Guard to take you out because you're a bad person, right? And so he termed this a square deal. We need to create a square deal for America. And so he began to legislate or pass laws that began to protect people in America. And I'm going to give you guys a few examples of this. So if you want to come over to the board over here with me, I'm going to kind of explain this to you. So I'm going to kind of explain this graph that I've drawn on the board here. So as you guys know, when it comes to the economic spectrum, you have the left and you have the right. So if you're on the left, you believe that the economy should be controlled by the government. But the government should control the whole economy. And you can think about like Russia historically doing this, where all the wealth and all the power would go to the government and the government would distribute it equally. All economic plans would come through the government. And we'll talk more about that later when we cover communism. And the opposite side of this is what we call a capitalist or a laissez-faire economy, where the government plays almost no role in the economy. The economy is directed or controlled by people acting in their best self-interest. Now, when we talk about America in the early 1900s, we would say that America is very right-wing. Now, it's not perfectly right-wing because the government does have some control in the economy. And I can give you guys some examples of this. So an example of this would be the government does at this point support big business. The government is often doing what's in the best interest of big robber barons because they're making lots of tax money from this. An example of this, as I taught you back in grade 10, is when the United Fruit Company was building big plantations down in Colombia. The government of the United States sent in the Marine Corps to support, right, capitalist interests in South America. The government also at this point stops the formation of unions to protect large capitalist business owners. And then the other thing is that the economy at this time is largely controlled by huge monopolies like Standard Oil or the United Fruit Company. We talked about this, where large corporations don't just control just oil, right? But they control gas stations and restaurants and transportation companies, and they're all conglomerating together and controlling vast amounts of the global economy. And because of that, they have a huge influence on government. So we know in the early American Industrial Revolution era, in the early 1900s, the government of the United States is not completely out of the economy. However, with the election of Teddy Roosevelt, we do see a shift towards the left, where the government becomes more involved in the economy in order to protect the rights of people. And some examples of it, we call this American progressivism. Some examples of this is with the election of Teddy Roosevelt comes a bunch of new pieces of legislation. And I'll explain each of these. So these are the Sherman Act, the Elkins Act, the Food and Drug Act, the Square Deal, Antiquities Act, and the Forest Conservation Act. So I'll just give you a few examples of this. So like, for example, the Sherman Act was an act put in place by Roosevelt that said that large corporations could not conglomerate. It was illegal now for the Standard Oil Company to buy or to become associated with another large company and form a large monopoly. That became illegal in order to make sure that competition was fair between different corporations. The Elkins Act is another example of this, where they made it like there was examples where the Standard Oil, which is a large corporation, would get special benefits from, like, for example, the train company. They would get their shipping would be cheaper simply because they were more powerful and more wealthy. And then if I was a smaller corporation, my shipping on the trains would be more expensive. And so certain favors would be given by one corporation towards another simply because of allegiances. So those became illegal under what was called the Elkins Act. The Food and Drug Act happened with the writing of a book by a man by the name of Sinclair, who talked about in Chicago, by meat packing plants selling bad meat to the public. And people were dying from this bad meat. And so the government stepped in and said, maybe we have a responsibility as the government to make sure people's food and their drugs that they're taking from pharmacies are safe for consumption. So the government began to regulate that. The Antiquities Act, the government began to protect important historical sites from private owners either benefiting from those sites or destroying those sites. And then the last here is the Forest Conservation Act, where Roosevelt actually protected like thousands, I can't even remember the number, millions of square acres of forest land. He conserved it so that large corporations couldn't come in and just cut down all the forest. But what's interesting about all of these new pieces of legislation is none of them are actually doing the individual worker any favors. The government isn't stepping in and protecting labor rights or making equal wages or providing welfare. Each of these are ways of regulating big business, essentially. However, this is a step in this direction. It is a step towards the left, right? It is the government becoming more involved in the economy, but it's on a very small scale. And that's why I haven't put it way over on the left. I've just kind of showed a little bit of a shift. Now, in the 1920s, everything in America changes, right? This little shift that had taken place goes back and reverts back to where it used to be. We see that left shift moving back hard to the right. And the question is, what caused this major shift? So I'm going to have you guys take a few minutes, and I want you to think about what in the 1920s may have caused the American people to vote for leaders, right? Like Coolidge and Harding, for example, President Coolidge and President Harding, that would shift the American economy back towards more of a laissez-faire style of economy instead of continuing on this left-moving cycle. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to think about why that might be, and then I'm going to answer that for you and see if you got the right answers. So I'm assuming that all of you paused the video or stopped the video and thought this through in your heads, right? Okay, well, if you didn't, you're a bunch of jerks. So the point is, what caused the American people to elect leaders that would shift the American economy back towards the right, especially when they made so much progress? And it has to do with these two reasons. So the first is because when people are really, really rich, they're usually pretty happy. After World War I, all the soldiers came home, right? If you remember from talking in grade 11, America wasn't hurt by World War I. They only really benefited. They did do some fighting for like the last 6 months and then came home and were like, hey, we're the victors. We're the best. But because Europe was so destroyed, all the fields were destroyed, all of the resources were destroyed, Europe became dependent on America. And so American businesses started to thrive and make a ton of money. And people could take their money and invest it in the economy, like invest it into stocks or into bonds and make a crazy amount of money. So people were borrowing money from the banks and then investing that money into the stocks and making money. So in the 1920s, we're going to talk about the roaring 20s, right? Became a time when people had a lot of money, or at least felt like they had a lot of money. They might have not actually had money. They just felt like they did, because it's the first time in American history when people started to buy things on credit, right? And anytime people have a credit card and they go and buy a big screen TV, they feel rich even though they're not rich. So that is the first reason. So the American economy starts to boom as a result of the fall or the end of World War I and the European dependence on America. The second reason is because people in America begin to fear the idea of government control over the economy in the form of communism. So in 1917, as you probably should know, or maybe you don't know, in 1917, Russia moved into what was called the Bolshevik Revolution. So a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin thought that communism was the best system, and a huge civil war broke out in Russia, and non-communists and communists were fighting each other and killing each other. And by 1922, the communists won. And when Americans looked at that, they thought, man, we don't want that in our country. We don't want anything that looks at all like communism. So people were afraid of this idea of government control over the economy because that sounded a lot like communism. That also came as a result of a massive terrorist attack. This is the largest terrorist attack in American history prior to 9/11. So on Wall Street, an Italian man who claimed to be a communist, right, took his automobile and filled it with a bunch of gunpowder and whatnot and crashed into a large bank and blew up the front of this bank, and 38 people died. So Americans saw communism as not only the cause of civil war, like in Russia, but also they saw it as potentially threatening to their well-being, right? They saw it as something that was terrorist or something that was fearful. Because if you know anything about communism, you should know that communism seeks to control the world internationally. So the fear of Americans was, if we allow immigrants to come into our country, if we allow ourselves to become too open-minded to government control of the economy, we are going to end up like Russia. And so this also caused a massive feeling of xenophobia. And so in the early 1900s, between 1918 and 1925 to 1930, somewhere in there, there's almost no immigrants that come to America, right? America closed off their borders because they're afraid that communist ideas are going to creep their way into America. So this was called the First Red Scare.